going to go through a critique now of both standards together because there's a lot of commonality between them. And then we'll call out the separate pieces where there is a difference, a uniqueness between them. So we're going to look at this document here, and we'll have a link to this in the description. And this was done by a group in the UK called the Safe Schools Alliance, which actually reviewed both documents. And they produced this very detailed document themselves, which is a review of the two standards. And it goes through an awful lot of detail. We're only going to go through a top-level summary of the points that they've raised. But if you do want to get more detail, you can download this document, take a look at it yourself. It's, they put a lot of work into it. So we're going to use some of that. And then we're going to supplement what's in this document with some additional points that I think are very relevant, that possibly don't come out strongly enough or aren't raised at all in that document. So we'll bring out our own ones. So this is the Safe Schools Alliance, as I said. They have a concern. Their general issue here is the whole sex positive view and this impact on safeguarding. You're bringing up teams and, at a too young an age. And, they see, it's one of the things you'll see in their feedback is the whole issue of safeguarding. And obviously, this goes back to the Alfred Kinsey view, the Freudian view of sexuality. And then there's an alignment with queer theory, as we kind of know. And this whole abandonment of the role of parents and family, they do feel that this comes through in the document. So, we'll kind of see that on the different points. They basically say that the two documents are complementary in terms of the sex positivity and queer theory. And I'm not going to disagree with that. I think that's fair to say that. Abandoning safeguarding is definitely a bit of an issue here at those younger age groups. And I think we've seen that. And you're exposing kids to things that are inappropriate. Some of those statements from the WHO document, that even the one that you brought up, Jana, you're talking about, bringing in the aspect of consent and whether you have to go with it or not, and then not telling your parents, perhaps having secrets. And there's all sorts of awful stuff in that WHO document. It's really not appropriate at all. And there's still bits of it in this document. So that's a real problem. That's a real problem. The whole thing that children are sexual from birth, this underlying view that this is the thing, and hence you need to expose them to everything, and it's fine. It's all going back to the Kinsey. We covered it off in the first video, and where he got his data from, which was not a good place. So this whole thing of the sexual pleasure aspect and children's sexual rights. And you've got these two groups, the International Planned Parenthood and the World Association of Sexology, bringing out these declarations of sexual rights. I mean, those are just NGO groups. They're not the United Nations. They're not anybody else. So to declare that something is rights-based based on what one of those people are saying is just crazy.
Yeah.
So this whole notion of children's sexual rights thing is a fallacy.
Yeah.
The only United Nations,
imagine NGOs who think children are sexual telling parents, you stay out of the way, your children have sexual rights. I mean, that should terrify any parent.
It's crazy. It's crazy. The only right that's in the United Nations rights is regarding child abuse and children having sufficient knowledge to be able to offset, the risks of child abuse. That's kind of the only fundamental right. All the other stuff, you've got all this contrived stuff from International Planned Parenthood and the WAS, and so this is nonsense, and they're referred to in the WHO document. So the gender ideology we talked about. Let's go back to this. Sorry, it's there. We saw it, and it's the postmodern view of this, the construction of gender, and then the what follows that. Then, obviously, if you've got a misalignment with your gender and all that kind of thing. So that's in there. It doesn't talk about grooming at all, which is interesting. So it doesn't, from a safeguarding perspective, and putting children on their guard with regard to being groomed, etc. So that's not kind of referenced, which is an issue. It brings in this layered approach. So particularly the WHO document, you start with the 0 to 4 age group, you then go to the 5 to 8, and etc. And you're layering on this knowledge, this sexual knowledge, as over each of those age groups. So And that's it's just starting too soon, and it's too much too soon, as we've kind of seen.
It's getting it into the children's consciousness. If you have age 4, we talked about in the WHO, the masturbation, age 9, sex, or all this pleasure, it's bringing things into the child's consciousness to break it down, to take their innocence away, to normalize this for children. So they have there's no boundaries. It's all blurred between the children and adult. That transition is blurred. It all becomes one.
Yeah.
So the childhood innocence is completely stripped away and stolen.
You would see from, say, a child being distressed, and you could find that they had been exposed to something inappropriate, perhaps. Now that's gone because they're getting exposed to this stuff from a very early age, and so that's the whole safeguarding risk that you're bringing in there. So let's go on. So we've got again, sexual abuse and think this whole notion of consent. So they've kind of taken the consent, like these are children, they're not adults. So the protection of these children, it's kind of handing over that responsibility in terms of consent to the child.
Yeah.
So like a 10-year-old, it's ridiculous. So that's a real problem, and that they're kind of bringing out here. This interactions between parents and children, we talked about this, and maybe siblings or whatever, and kind of muddying the waters between a kind of platonic relationship with the sexual kind of relationship, or bringing in sexual connotations into that. Again, that's just terrible. It's this is really bad, to be honest, to bring in this kind of view. So not good. Age appropriateness is out the window, as we saw with the WHO document, and it's pretty bad in the UNESCO one as well. But it's really bad in the WHO one. There's no doubt about that. The minimum standards for sexual experience, so age is kind of a kind of a benchmark, I guess. At different ages, you expose to different things. But they talk about this developmental appropriateness, and I've seen this term used elsewhere as well. I've seen this used in the Dr. Ifaniri's speech to the Dáil Committee on Education, that children at a younger age may develop quicker, so they may be further along the path, so you can expose them to more. And potentially they can consent at a younger age, kind of thing, right? That's, if you extrapolate that, that's what you're kind of talking about there. So this is kind of a worrying aspect. No prescribed limits upon sexual knowledge or experience at any age. So they're really not, again, it's coming back to this whole aspect of safeguarding, potentially the children being exploited, having this inappropriate exposure from a very early age.
And it really, like I said, it blurs the line between child, adolescent, adult. There's no lines. Those lines diminish. It's if they're developmentally ready, they can consent, they can learn about sexual pleasure. We have one shot at childhood to get it right, like one shot. And childhood is really a very short time in the children's life. Once they go to secondary school, they're adolescents at that point. They're teenagers. They're nearly at that adult point when they graduate secondary school. We have one shot to get childhood right, one shot at childhood innocence. And once that innocence is shattered, you can't go back and fix it. It's gone. And this is breaking down that childhood innocence, the magic of childhood, the innocence of childhood, the beauty of children's innocence, shatters it, breaks it down.
So they talk about this holistic sexuality education. Again, it's this whole sex positive theme and sexualization of children from a very, very young age. The notion that what parents would do is insufficient. So you've got to get to the children very early because parents won't be able to deal with anything. And then this whole notion of getting rid of any opt-outs. This came up in the WHO document as well. It was one of the recommendations to remove any opt-outs. This is bad. This is showing the influence of the originators of this type of material, and that people like International Planned Parenthood, for example, having such an impact. Undermining family life, very, very much so, and moral development. It's just me taking that away from that, trying to separate the children from their parents at as young an age really as possible in terms of making them sexually independent and knowledgeable. So this other one here, vulnerability to power imbalances. So this is, how can a teacher even have the notion of a discussion on masturbation with a 4-year-old? it is just in no shape or form can that happen.
I can't
To be
imagine
honest.
my 5-year-old coming home from school saying, "Mommy, today I learned how to masturbate in school." I think, oh my, I just can't even imagine him running home from school to at the
I
school
know,
gate to tell me what he
I
learned.
know.
That just is, it's surreal. It's just, it's
Yeah,
bonkers.
It is crazy. So, given the such a young age, they're exposing some of these kids to some of these things.
Mm.
Now, a couple of other things that there really was very little discussion on disability. So when people talk about inclusion, it tends to be inclusion in terms of sexual orientation and gender and all of that, and race, for example, but it tends to not include disability and particularly autism. So that's a real concern, and we've seen that here in our own guidelines
Yep.
in this country.
Yep.
The evidence base is weak, and I think I showed that particularly at the young age groups. I don't think there's any real evidence base at all in the sub-9 age group at all. I think it's effectively zero. So I think there is evidence for the older ages because there's an awful lot more data, an awful lot more studies.
Mm.
Um, this whole thing of children being sexual, sex positive approach again. The notion of gender identity, which again talking about queer theory, the philosophies behind these, childhood sexuality, and the research of Kinsey, as we kind of mentioned already, and a general point that the Safe Schools Alliance were making, and this I've seen this point made before, is the regulation with regard to the creation of training for sexuality education. It's a little bit experimental right now, and we've seen that with what's come out of DCU. That they're kind of learning as they go. So some of the stuff is pretty awful because the learning is going to have to be reined in. That we know that we've had visibility to that. So this is a real problem, and it's exposing kids to things that are totally inappropriate because of this lack of standardization. It's kind of you're playing with fire here because this is such an important thing in a child's development, and essentially the sort of material for young children in particular, they're getting shown stuff that is really only appropriate for older children. But basically, people are just taking the material from older children and exposing them to younger children.
In the Children's First Act of 2015, I think it's under emotional abuse, it's considered emotional abuse by showing children material that they are not mentally mature enough to handle. So that is emotional abuse, and sexual abuse is showing them sexually explicit material that's often what happens when there's a perpetrator during the grooming process. So if we look at our own Children First Act in 2015 that was passed by referendum here in Ireland, some of the things going into schools and libraries clearly break the Children First Act of 2015. So it's abuse to children to put this material into their minds. And, if a child's on a playground and they fall and they skin their knee, that's going to heal and they're going to forget about it in a year. But when this material and content gets pushed into their brains and their innocence is shattered, it's never going to leave their minds. This is going to be in their minds forever. It's going to scar them. It's not like a skinned knee. So it's really damaging.
Two major issues with the WHO standards, right? So we're going to focus on them for a little minute. This whole influence of the International Planned Parenthood, the ancestry of that organization. And don't tell me that an organization can suddenly change its ethos over the years from what it was and its founder. So their attitude towards the unborn and towards young people who are gender confused is despicable. So personally, I don't have any confidence in that organization and anything that would ever come out of it, ever. So that's it. So they had a huge influence on the WHO standard, and we can see it. The material is vile. The material we've seen in that is the worst I've ever seen in any document published by anybody from a sexuality education perspective. It is absolutely vile. There's no doubt about it. Now, let's look at the UNESCO one. So the first issue, which would be a concern to most parents, is the whole issue of gender identity and the way that it's taught. And it's taught purely from the ideological viewpoint. That's it. It's not taught in any other way. It's the postmodern view, the gender queer theory view of gender identity. That's what it is. So that's the first concern. And this is in the material in our schools today. They're getting it as part of anti-bullying, and they're getting it in their SPHE RSE school curriculum. So it's there. We have it in the books.
Kids are being told that they can be boy, girl, neither, or both with a little genderbread person. They're talking about all their new vocabulary, your cisgender, transgender, non-binary. The classes are being asked to research their favorite transgender celebrity and present back to the class. And the other thing to point out for parents watching this, which is really, really important and really, really worrying, is that opting out is going to be pointless because this is going to be infiltrated into every subject in the curriculum. This queer theory, Marxism, it's going to be could be in math, could be in history, everywhere in the curriculum. So opting out will not protect your child. So we need to really work on getting the schools to just scrap this all together.
And just to reiterate, I mentioned it before, there's no mention of gender dysphoria, there's no mention of desistance, and no mention of detransitioning. So not only are they just giving you the full ideological view, they're not actually giving you the other important information you need to know on this topic at all. So you're not getting the children are not even getting the full story. They're getting one half of a bad story, and they're not getting the other half of it, which they should be getting. So it is reprehensible that that's happening.
And with the damning Cass report, which is public, it'd be very interesting to see how the Irish schools, the Department of Education, can justify teaching a child about this information, and socially transitioning them in schools, teaching them something that could lead them to puberty blockers, hormones, surgeries. So basically, surgical and medical castration and sterilization.
The normalization of this broad spectrum of sexual practices. So apologies for people for some of the terms here, but this is what kids in the junior cycle, I should say, are getting exposed to at the moment in various activities and in some of the actual books. They could talk of masturbation, obviously, vaginal sex, anal sex, oral sex, fisting, and the use of sex toys.
Pushing adult fetishes onto children, and anybody who takes a common sense approach and has child safeguarding at the forefront, anybody should disagree that this is okay for children to push adult fetishes onto children. That is completely wrong, no matter where you sit on any political spectrum.
We had the whole discussion over age appropriateness. And that, there's multiple areas. You have to go through the detail to kind of see where that is. But these are the other two big issues I think most parents would be concerned about coming from these standards. There's a definite postmodern tone to the UNESCO document, as we saw, the social construction of gender. That's a postmodern term. It has a better age group, but again, I think the 5 to 8 age group is just too young. I think it's just the stuff that's in there just doesn't make sense. So I think it doesn't have the 0 to 4, which is good, but I think the 5 to 8 needs to go as well. It talks about this whole rights-based thing. We mentioned that about the IPPF and WAS, but their rights don't hold any water. I'm sorry. Those are NGOs. And the problem right now is that both documents are referenced here by the departments, the Department of Health and the Department of Education. So the worst aspects of both of these documents could be justified today. As it stands today, with those two documents being live documents that are in use, we kind of have to live with anything that's in either of them, which is not good, right? That's pretty horrendous to think about that, particularly when you look at the primary curriculum that we're now looking at. This whole sex for pleasure ethos is a common problem in both documents. You can see it. It's coming from the likes of WAS and CICUS. That's what these organizations, that's what they're into. They're into a sex positive view, getting early teenagers engaging in sexual encounters from an early age. And it's all fine so long as they use protection and there's consent. That's kind of the viewpoint. It's sex for pleasure, and you're good to go. I think there's a huge issue here. From a morality perspective, it's tempting to normalize everything. And obviously not even having a view to relationships, as the point you made, that they're not talking about contextualizing sex with relationship, having an impact on, children's viewpoints. And this is kind of social engineering aspect of, you have to celebrate the diverse, the non-normative aspect, which the queer theory sexual practices would be kind of coming from. And you've kind of got to disregard your own beliefs and morality and kind of leave them at the door. which was kind of been alluded to in the UNESCO document, kind of challenging your own, what you grew up with. And we can see this in SPHE as well, so as inclusiveness is happening in one direction, but not in the other direction. It's not trying to include people who do have certain beliefs, etc. They're not being included, unfortunately. It really looks like somebody, as I said, shoehorned in the older material into the younger age groups, just exposing the younger people to stuff that's totally inappropriate. The way it's written right now, if you were to convert that into an actual curriculum in a school for young kids, like even for the primary curriculum, for example, right now, it would be horrible material. The material would be absolutely outrageous.
My age 5 and my age 8 would be very uncomfortable with that material. They would be traumatized, and I can see them being very upset going through some of the material that we walk through. I mean, some of it, as an adult, I felt violated seeing some of it. I can't imagine a 4-year-old, 5-year-old child.
Yeah, it's horrendous. So as long as that document exists, it can be referenced and people can justify it. So I think it has to go. I think the WHO standards for sexuality education in Europe needs to be cancelled. I just think this document is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
It's outrageous. How there hasn't been outrage up to now on this document, I'm just flabbergasted that nobody else has been apart from Safe Schools UK, who produced the document that we'll reference. They called it out, and there's a few. We'll include 1 or 2 videos if we can that call it out as well.
Yeah.
But even like, what's wrong with our government? Where are the adults in the room? Have the adults all left the room that they think that WHO document is acceptable? So let's talk about a few other points. So this overemphasis on pleasure, no real consideration for the emotional consequences, and that's particularly for girls. I think they're the ones that are going to feel the pain most of all. And I think it doesn't consider children, who maybe from an emotional development perspective, like on the autistic spectrum, could be quite challenged. And again, there's no consideration for them. And as I say here, there is no condom that's been developed that's going to protect a young person's emotional well-being or their moral conscience. So you may think you've got protection, from an STD or something, but you're not going to protect the child from the emotional aspects of engaging in kind of random sex, basically for pleasure, which is kind of what's being promoted here.
If they start having just random sex for pleasure at a very young age and have all these adult fetishes pushed on them, they're going to suffer emotional trauma.
Oh, yeah.
They probably will be more hesitant to actually settle down and potentially get married and have a family. And I mean, we're not going to have, I mean, we look at the birth rates are going way down in Ireland. Ireland is not having the babies. Well, if we traumatize all of our youth and they don't want to get married and have babies, there's going to be no procreation either.
Yeah, and ultimately the kids aren't going to be they're not going to be happy, right? I mean,
No.
I think what any parent wants for their children is to be safe, healthy, and happy. And and this is not going to align with that, unfortunately. So this double standard of material that's acceptable for the classroom, but which you can't show on primetime TV, you can't put into a newspaper, and you couldn't actually show it to a child outside of the classroom, or you'd be arrested for doing that. So we have this double standard in terms of this material that's available, the books, some of those library books, and is totally unacceptable to expose to minors, and young minors at that, like 12, 11 year old children. I think in general parents don't have an issue with state education, that's medically sound, age appropriate, for their children, because I think most parents are going to admit that they don't have all the knowledge on this, and they don't mind somebody else doing this, again assuming age appropriate, etc., and without having any sort of ideological or political influences coming into bear. I mean, you want it to be neutral. You don't want any other stuff coming in, because then that's just going to create the issues we're seeing, because ideology is pushing different viewpoints, it's pushing the age appropriateness aspect, etc. I think the standards aren't that today. Both of those standards don't fit the bill. The WHO one is totally outrageous, and that just needs to go. And I think if there was to be a consensus, let's give input on the UNESCO standards. Ireland should be doing this as a country. We shouldn't be just taking this stuff. We should be saying, again, we need to stand up as adults, as a country, and say, we're not happy with those standards. We'd like to provide some input into them. Now, the problem is we've got an issue in our own country. So, that's not going to happen until we sort out the adults in the room in Ireland. But there's an issue. So both of these standards right now are a problem, and they're going to, as long as they exist, they're going to continue to be a problem in terms of the curriculum and material that the HSE produce. That whole age inappropriateness is just a disaster, and particularly bad at the lower age groups. The sex positive view, the queer theory view, which is the subversion of normalcy. So what was considered normal in the past is now not considered, is considered not inclusive. So you've got to disregard your normalcy. You've got to bring in all these extra sexual practices and everything and say they're all normal and they're fine, and we should teach them to the kids at 11. That's a problem. This whole ideological, depathologized view of gender confusion, where we don't even tell the kids that gender dysphoria exists. We don't tell kids that they might be, if their gender distress might be due to other reasons. We just tell them that it's because it's their gender identity, and their gender is socially constructed. And so that if they've got a confusion, they're actually trans and they need to medicalize. That's just terrible. And I think there will be lawsuits in the future because we're teaching that. I think some parents and some children who've been subject to this and find fertility issues in the future, etc., and their future's destroyed, basically, will be taking the state to task. And all they have to do is show one of the school books and they'll win their case. I talked about the social engineering aspect. So this whole area of critical social justice, which has been kind of brought to bear, and we're going to see that in the primary cycle, and this area of inclusion as a justification to expose kids to things that are just not appropriate. I've had people ask me, like, what is fisting? I didn't want to try to explain it to them, but
no.
Most normal people don't get exposed to that. Like, people put this down as LGBTIA inclusion. I think that's been very disingenuous to young people who may be gay or lesbian, etc. They're the same. They're young people as well, growing up, who need to, grow up properly, not be exposed to inappropriate stuff at the wrong age, etc. It's the same whether you're LGBTQ or you're straight or whatever.
This degeneracy strips children of dignity. It really removes the dignity for that child, whether they're a gay child, straight child, whatever. It takes away dignity when you start bringing this into the child's consciousness.
They've an entitlement to a childhood, just like anybody else, and to be to say that this is an excuse to sexualize everybody in the class is ridiculous. So that's it. That's the WHO and UNESCO standards. They're not fit for purpose, unfortunately. They're international standards that our own government is bought into, and our Department of Education and Health executive are bought into. So they're a problem for us right now. They're a problem for every parent in this country right now, as they exist in their current forms.